Hi everyone, I'm Pia Ramchandrani. I'm a third-year student at Wharton in my PhD, and I'm here to present some work I've been doing with Hamsa, Bastani, and Ken Moon, also at Wharton, on responsible sourcing and supply chains. So you might have heard of corporate social responsibility. There's been a rising interest in this topic as companies are more interested in trying to engage society in something that's impactful, mostly because consumers have been very interested in this area. So you can see here, even Darth Vader wants to move away from being known for his evil plans and super weapons, and he wants to be rebranded for more of his corporate social responsibility. When we think about supply chains and how goods are produced, a common way to implement corporate social responsibility is through certification programs. So you can think about one example is fair trade that you might be familiar with. So these third-party certifiers like fair trade, they set standards. So you can see on this page, fair trade has standards around trade, pricing, social working conditions, environmental impact, et cetera. But they also provide external auditing. So fair trade then goes in and audits to make sure that their suppliers are actually abiding by these standards. And then finally, they offer some consumer signaling so that when a customer goes into the store and they see this fair trade logo, they know, hey, this product was actually produced under the standards that fair trade has endorsed. So an example here, you might have seen at the grocery store, Cafe Altura, you see fair trade front and center, their little fair trade label. We know this particular coffee product was produced under fair trade standards. But you might notice the rest of the coffee products in this picture do not have any sort of third-party endorsement. And this is what we call dual sourcing, when a company sources some of their products through certified channels, but then the rest through non-certified channels. And this is fairly common. Actually, about 21% of coffee brands took this strategy and only certified about 5% of their sales. And there's a lot of concern about this, particularly from the Fair Labor Association. They're assuming that this fair trade coffee itself was produced under good standards, but that the rest of the coffee produced was done under economic standards and really focused on getting it cheaply and not necessarily focusing on the ethics. And so they have a lot of concerns around these dual sourcing strategies. However, we did a number of interviews with coffee companies and they said, hey, we're actually focused on being ethical. And not only that, we learned from our experience working with third-party certifiers, and we build relationships and we improve our standards and our auditing practices in the rest of our supply chain, even if it's not third-party certified. So there's a debate going on here between the private sector and some of the more nonprofit NGO sector. Another way to do corporate social responsibility in your supply chain is to have your own internal standards. So this is if, rather than going through a third-party certifier, you come up with your own program. Don Pablo has this sharing certified program that's internal. This other company says this co-op is doing great things to create unity across disparate groups. So they have some sort of internal strategy around having social impact, unclear exactly what it is. This is actually fairly popular as well. In 2016, 31% of global grocery sales had some sort of on-pack marketing claim that said, hey, we're doing something socially good. And a lot of concern is existing around these claims as well. Particularly, FAO has said that there's a risk of causing confusion. Some of these look like formal certification programs when they're not, and so that could cause confusion for consumers. The other is they're concerned about cheap talk. Like, who knows what this means? This co-op is doing great things to create unity. We're not really sure if this coffee company is actually doing any good. So we want to investigate two questions. One is there evidence that dual sourcing firms enjoy operational spillovers? So are these dual sourcing companies actually maintaining ethical sourcing in the rest of their non-certified supply chain is our first question. The second question is, are firms with these self-made on-pack marketing claims that are becoming so popular, are they actually behaving responsibly? And we want to look at this in a mature market. So we focus on the coffee market. This graph here is fair trade certified products over time in the United States. This blue bar is coffee, and you can see coffee is the most mature in the US when it comes to certification. Actually, fair trade began in coffee in Europe in the 70s, didn't make its way over to the US to the late 90s, but you could still see it's by far the most mature when we compare it to other products. So we focus our analysis on the coffee market. So we collect data on violations, both environmental and social violations around the world. We collect data on Nielsen Retail Scanner, which is sales data, as well as product labeling data. So we could see if a product has some sort of self-made claim or certification on it. We also collect news data so that we can see how often a company is talked about, because this will increase the likelihood that they're actually caught with the violation. And then finally, we collect data on Panjiva supply chain data, so we could see actually which countries these coffee companies are sourcing their beans from. So we end up with a panel data set from 2006 to 2017 on 50 coffee companies, around 130 brands that accounts for about 60% of the US coffee market. So our first question, do these spillovers that coffee companies claim exist actually exist? So what we want to look at is a graph where the x-axis is percentage sales with certification across the supply chain, and the y-axis is violations per sale. And existing operational theory, as well as experts in the field, expect that there's going to be a downward-facing, somewhat linear trend where as you certify more of your supply chain, you get fewer and fewer violations. This makes sense because you expect as you have more of your farmers abiding by the standards of a third-party certifier, you're expecting to lower your certification with that kind of linear rate. What we actually see is more of an L-shaped phenomena, where once a company reaches about a 3% certification of their portfolio, they achieve about a 70% drop in violations. And from there on out, it's fairly flat in terms of improvements to violation rates. And so this is actually evidence that supports that companies that are dual sourcing are behaving ethically in their non-certified supply chain, and that they might be experiencing those spillover effects that they were discussing in their interviews. Which brings me to my second question. Are these companies with self-made claims behaving responsibly? And you can see here a map of violations per shipment coming out of the country from around the world. So this leads, you can source from different types of countries to achieve ethical sourcing. One is you can source from safe countries like Colombia, where there's very few violations per shipment. And that way, Colombia has a lot of enforcement and a lot of the ethical and environmental standards so that the company has to do less in terms of auditing and enforcement, and they're more likely to guarantee that they have low violation rates. So that's one, you could source from safe countries. The second approach for ethical sourcing is actually going to these high-risk countries. So you can see Indonesia is fairly dark. There's a lot of violations per shipment coming out of Indonesia. There's kind of a really rough regulatory environment, lax regulations. So it's very difficult to source from these places. But if you want to source ethically, you have to go in there, set up the right suppliers, set up the right auditing, the right standards. It's a lot of work. But once you do that, there's actually evidence that companies that source ethically from these countries make improvements in the conditions in those countries. There's improvements in income and education rates, et cetera. So that's actually the ideal way to source ethically. So when we look at this question, we do find that companies that are both dual sourcing and companies with self-made claims have a significant reduction in violations when compared to other companies across the board. We were quite excited to see this. Personally, I expected the self-made claims companies to be all cheap talk. If they're just smacking a label on their packaging with no external auditing, I thought they would make it up, but it looks like they're actually behaving quite ethically relative to other companies. These dual sourcing companies are behaving much more ethically, but both are doing fairly well. However, when we control for which countries these companies are sourcing from, the advantage these self-made claims companies have is virtually erased. So that means when we compare a company with self-made claims sourcing from the same country as a company without claims, they're not behaving that much better. So these companies with self-made claims are able to keep their violations low, primarily just by sourcing from low-risk countries or these safe countries. While these dual sourcing companies that have some of their portfolio certified are able to keep violations significantly lower no matter where they source from. And even when you look at high-risk countries, they're even able to keep their violations much lower in those high-risk countries. So what are our takeaways? One, certified production can have spillover effects. So these companies that are dual sourcing do behave ethically in their uncertified supply chain. Two, companies with self-made claims are more responsible than we expected, but primarily due to sourcing from safe countries to keep it easier. And three, these dual sourcing companies can source responsibly even in high-risk regions and perform better than other companies in all countries that they source from. So what does this mean for the ecosystem? And more of the mechanism design questions that are relevant for this audience. One is how to help self-made claims companies find these safe countries to source from. The second is how do these dual sourcing companies optimize these learning labs to be able to benefit from the certified supply chain they have and improve their uncertified supply chain and better support the high-risk sourcing countries that they go to? And finally, how do certifiers actually support relationship development and facilitate this learning? So potentially shifting the role from the certifier as purely setting standards and auditing is actually helping these dual sourcing companies perform better even in their uncertified supply chain. So there's a lot of questions around here that we can explore in the mechanism design space.